Hi everybody. As I said, my name's John Hare-Winton. I'm a senior QA automation engineer at The Guardian. If you don't know who The Guardian are, we're based in London and we're the second largest English language news company in the world, depending on whose numbers you look at, whose numbers you believe. Just before we get started, who was in Eagle's talk earlier? It was called Test Automation Do the Same But Better. Okay, not too many. When he started talking, the further he went into his talk, I had this sinking feeling that we were going to talk about almost exactly the same thing. But we're going to be okay. There is new stuff in here. So I work for The Guardian. We develop our own website, our own mobile apps, and those are viewed by about 9 million people per day. We also develop our own editorial tools, so the tools that our journalists use to create all our content, that's built in-house as well. It's built by a team of about 160 people, and about 12 of those are QAs, and we release these products about 400 times per day. So if anyone wants to talk about fast delivery, we can do that later as well. But yeah, freeing up Selenium, we're talking about Selenium. So quick disclaimer here, I will use the term Selenium and WebDriver completely interchangeably. Because for the purposes of this talk, they are the same thing. Some of the other components of Selenium, stuff like Grid, it all relies on WebDriver underneath, so that's what we're actually talking about here. And also, everything I'm saying about WebDriver and some of the principles we're going to talk about around UI testing, using WebDriver as the main one, because that's kind of the industry standard, but any other UI testing tools you're using, these principles very much apply as well, but we're really going to center in on Selenium. So. Yeah, Selenium, it's kind of synonymous with UI test automation now. Quite often, if we're recruiting test engineer kind of equals Selenium engineer for most of the industry. And that's because it's an amazing tool. It's really great. And as an industry, we've completely embraced it and what it can do for us, which sounds great. It's awesome. So why am I doing a talk about it? There must be a problem. Well, there is a problem, I think, in the Selenium world, but it's not with Selenium, it's with us. There aren't too many terrible gifts, don't worry. And what I see the problem as is that we're kind of stifling Selenium, and we're using it badly, because a lot of the time, or most of the time, all we're focusing on doing is exactly replicating our old manual regression tests. Is that a problem? I really should have made that be able to stop. It's really distracting, isn't it? But yeah, why is that a problem? Isn't that what we're meant to be doing with tests? Is just replicating, when we're automating, we're just meant to be replicating manual effort and making it quicker and more reliable. Well, no, that's not what we should be doing with it. It might be what our businesses are asking for, but can't we push it just a bit further than just replicating what we used to do as manual testers? And I think we can, because as test engineers, we've got the skills to make a huge difference to our teams and our products. But we're limiting the impact we have by viewing automated tests just as a replacement for manual, rather than going in a whole new direction. And I see this kind of as boiling down to two big problems that we have. And that's firstly that as test engineers, we actually underestimate what we're capable of building and what we're capable of doing. And then secondly, this is going to sound like a very sweeping statement, we're doing WebDriver all wrong. A lot of the time we're not using it for what it was meant to be used for. So this is just a quick outline of what we're going to talk about. So I'll talk about the problem as I see it and go into a bit more detail around those two things of underestimating ourselves and doing WebDriver kind of wrong. But I'm not just going to rant and complain, I am actually going to give some solutions and hopefully some kind of principles that you can take away and apply to your own testing. And then we're going to tie it back into the title of the talk and see what I mean by freeing up Selenium. So yeah, that's how things are going to pan out. So let's go straight in on the first problem of underestimating ourselves. And a lot of people I've heard people talk about this as the tester inferiority complex, which I think is an absolute load of rubbish, because it's not an inferiority complex, and a lot of people sort of see testers almost sort of test engineers as kind of like junior developers. That's not what it is at all. It's us not appreciating just how much development we're capable of doing with the skills we've got as test engineers. And I think this is because a lot of people, I mean, we could probably do hands around the room in a sec, a lot of people come into automated testing from a manual testing background. How many of you have kind of made that transition from being a manual tester to an automated tester? Now, how many of you had actually written some code before you started automating? A few of you. So yeah, it sounds like a lot of you kind of went on a similar journey to what I did. I started off as a manual tester and then learnt to code by doing WebDriver. And that's great because it's a really, really good gateway. You're kind of doing this procedural development. It's a really, really good gateway into coding. But it can cause problems for us. And firstly, in that we start off by approaching everything from the UI level. We keep the systems a black box still. And because that's the sphere we come from as manual testers, we couldn't go that far into the system. And secondly, and probably more importantly, we quite often, and like from going to meetups and talking to people about this, it seems to be quite a common thing, is that because we learned to code by doing WebDriver, we think we've learned WebDriver, but we haven't learned to code. And we kind of don't understand quite how much we're capable of doing technically. But that's incorrect. We haven't just learned WebDriver, we have learned to code. Because if you can build or work with a page object-based framework, you're probably using something like Cucumber or something like that, then you can code. You definitely can. You might not have like the theoretical underpinning to the things you know. You might not necessarily know the technical names for all the things that you're doing with your code, but those are easier obstacles to overcome than actually learning in the first place. When I first started doing automation, I've been kind of using a Selenium framework in Java for about 6 months. And my company sent me on just a normal Java development course, and they started talking about polymorphism and inheritance and instantiation and stuff like that, and I thought, this sounds terrifying. And then I realised that it's what I was already doing. Because quite often we're really bad at this in the tech industry, aren't we, of giving things really, really complicated names for like really, really simple concepts. But that's a bit of an aside. But what's kind of the manifestation of this? What does this look like in practice when we're kind of underestimating ourselves? Well, we end up doing this with our tests. So we kind of cling on to them really, really tightly, and we don't want our developers to look at our code or go anywhere near them because we think it might not be that good. And we want to kind of make ourselves into gatekeepers and kind of, we hold the doors to releasing and all that kind of stuff. And I mean, that kind of goes back to the old days of kind of, waterfall and V-model development, whereas it's an agile world now. We're not testing as a service, we're testing to help the rest of our team, and the whole team should own the tests. It shouldn't just be us owning the tests. But if we do this, we do cling to the tests and not want anyone else to, have any access to them or anything like that. That kind of accentuates the us and them divide between developers and testers, which in an agile world we don't want that at all. And that's kind of why quite often, how often do you get help from your developers with your tests, or how often do they actually investigate issues and fix the tests when there's something wrong with them? Or even worse, how often when you mention WebDriver do your devs just kind of sigh? And kind of despair a bit because they think it's it's flaky and unreliable and it's overly complicated and overrated. So it ends up just being you, just the tester. You're the only person on the team that cares about the tests, and that's not where we want to be in the agile world. So that's kind of the first problem as I saw it, and then the second problem that I mentioned is that we're kind of doing WebDriver all wrong. And what do I mean by that? Well, it's that thing I said about earlier, that we're just replacing the same manual test that we used to do in exactly the same style. So it's black box, we're testing solely in the UI, and we're not building the best things that we can build with the tools available to us like WebDriver. So what does that kind of look like, saying we're using WebDriver all wrong? Well, you probably can't see this that well. This is a question from a Google group, and I blurred out the username just in case that person's in the room. I don't want to shame them or anything. But it's someone asking for help automating a REST API using WebDriver, and could anyone give them some help with that? And some of the answers further down in this thread actually said stuff like, well, if you take your browser and you get you use like a Chrome plugin or something like that will render JSON really, really nicely for you, then get WebDriver to go to the page and then use driver.findElement to find all these chunks of JSON. And I thought, what? This is mad. And it's this kind of thing of, because we a lot of us we learned to code by doing WebDriver. WebDriver is the only thing we think to do, because it's all we think we know. And how else does this kind of manifest itself in doing WebDriver all wrong? Well, I was at a meetup a few weeks ago, and it was a room of sort of test engineers, and there seemed to be this kind of general consensus, and someone actually put it up on a slide, and everyone sort of nodded and agreed. That they said if you've got a test that includes an element of WebDriver to it, getting 75% reliability out of that test is the best that you could hope to achieve. And by 70% reliability, I mean only 75% of the time, whether the result of your test was pass or fail, only 75% of the time would that be accurate. And that's not good enough. We can't work with this. But it's easy to see how we kind of fell into this. When Selenium first came out, it was Selenium RC. It was all about remote playbacks. It kind of recorded your browser interactions, and the idea that was that you kind of augmented that code with additional assertions. But a lot of us didn't get very far with that, because it's going back to that thing of we were comfortable with it being a black box and not going any further in. But now we've got WebDriver, which is much more kind of code-based. But we still fall into this trap of replacing manual tests all the time, because we're already in that mindset. But this is kind of when it comes to the real crux of the problem of just replacing the old manual tests. Because those manual tests, those manual regression tests that we all used to run all the time, they worked, but they worked slowly. But they worked because people are perceptive and people are investigative, whereas WebDriver isn't. If you're a person executing a manual regression script, you're not just blinkered looking at the things you've been told to look at. If you notice anything else going on with the system, you're going to take that into account. Whereas WebDriver doesn't do that. So what is WebDriver? This is kind of like the important distinctions on, because WebDriver, it's become kind of a catch-all phrase for all our browser testing frameworks. Everyone's like, oh, it's WebDriver, that's the whole framework. Well, it's not, because what WebDriver really is, it's a brilliant API for automating browser actions, which is awesome, but that's it. You could argue that WebDriver itself is not a test framework at all, because it performs actions, but it doesn't itself test, because it doesn't assert anything. It doesn't report anything, it just does browser actions. All the test framework comes from whatever you package around it. So you might be in Java, you might use TestNG as your test framework, and then WebDriver just is one of the things that executes the steps in your test. So what this means, though, is because WebDriver is kind of this catch-all term for web automation, it means that we're asking too much of WebDriver, because we're using it too much and we're not using it well. Because it's this catch-all phrase, it then gets blamed for whatever goes wrong with our tests, because we're not testing that well. And that's bad. That means, on the team I work on at the moment, when I said about they've got a load of WebDriver tests, and I said, oh, we could make these better. Everyone was really keen just to get rid of them, because they hated WebDriver. They thought it was terrible. Whereas really, it wasn't. It was just being asked to do, or relied on to do, way more than it was ever designed to do. And the problem was with the test framework around it. So yeah, we're not saying kill WebDriver. I love WebDriver. WebDriver's great. But what we need to do is we need to use it better. So that's the end of the ranting section of the talk. We're now going to do solutions, which that's what everyone's actually here for. So I think we're doing WebDriver badly. What can we do about that? How can we fix that? Well, we need rules. We need some really, really strict rules about how we test, and how we test particularly with WebDriver. So what we're going to do, I'm going to go through these rules in a bit of detail. And these are rules that I've kind of applied to myself, and the other guys on my team have picked them up as well. And then we'll go through a real-world example. I'm not as brave as Igor earlier. I'm not going to do any live coding, because the idea of that absolutely terrifies me. But we're going to go through an example. It's going to be quite sort of high-level example. And then at the end of the talk, we're going to see that with those rules, how much further we can push WebDriver and what the other things we can do with it. So there's going to be two very general high-level testing rules, and then there's going to be three that are much more specifically for WebDriver or any kind of UI automation. So the general testing rules. First one is keep it simple. And the second one is make it testable. So we're going to go into both of those. So What do I mean by keep it simple? Well, avoid bloat, things that are just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, like this pufferfish. Because it's really easy to fall into the trap of overly large test infrastructure. Because there are some really, really good test frameworks out there. You know, stuff like Cucumber, you know, combining BDD principles with WebDriver tests. It's a really, really good idea. But these things aren't necessarily always the right choice. I mean, quite often, a lot of people that I've worked with, they've kind of got their ideal test framework, and then whatever team they go onto, they apply that test framework. But like was said in the keynote earlier, you know, a model doesn't work everywhere. A model it's a principle, it's an idea, but you can't apply it to absolutely everything. So your test framework, if say you put in a reporting suite, and then you put in something else, and it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And do you always need all of those things? Because quite often it might be a bit useful, but it's making your code base so much more complicated. And tests are going to be a thing that quite often, once you've built them, you're just going to dip into them every now and then, as they need a bit of maintenance, or when one fails and it needs checking. And if you've got this huge, complicated framework, you're probably the only person in your team that can do that. Whereas if it's really, really simple code, and the lightest framework you can possibly have, it's really, really easy for everybody else to dive in. Because if something makes it harder to jump in, that's a problem. It's not a solution. So we've got some obstacles to overcome, and I don't know why I put in a picture of Everest for that, but because that's not an obstacle many people can overcome. But so what we need to do is we need to make really, really good technical decisions around how we build our test frameworks. So that means stuff like language choices. So, you know, Selenium is brilliant because it uses the JSON wire protocol, which means WebDriver itself is actually language agnostic. You just use an implementation of it in whatever language you're using. And that means that pretty much every major language that's in use in commercial software, it has an implementation of WebDriver to some degree. So, if your team they work in Python, if everybody on your team works in Python, why are you building tests in Java? It might be because you know Java, but the rest of your team doesn't. You need to learn some Python in that case, because we need to bring these things as close to everybody else in the team as possible. And also, you know, location of your tests. Where do your tests live? Are they often a separate repo, or are they in the same repo as the product that they're testing? Because, you know, all these things can kind of add up to create distance between everybody else in the team and your tests. So using that example of, say you're using your team of Python devs, you're using Java, and you're in a separate repo, it means if one of your developers, if a test breaks when they commit something, they've then got to fire up a different IDE probably. They've got to, in their head, context shift to a completely different language, a completely different programming paradigm, and check out a different repo to have a look. It's too much distance, especially for something that should be very, very easy to jump into. So that's the first rule, kind of keeping it simple, keeping your framework as simple as possible. The second rule, and this is kind of the scarier one, or can be the scarier one, is making things testable. And Igor talked about this quite a lot earlier. And what I mean by this is, if your application, if you can't get to the points of it where your UI actions actually take effect, so say you're populating a field and then clicking save, if you can only do that on the UI, if you can't dig into the database or see the API where that change actually has an effect, your product isn't actually testable. I mean, I used to work at a couple of investment companies, and we used a lot of proprietary software and stuff that was developed by companies for us, and as the contracts, it was kind of closed source stuff. We couldn't drill into any of that stuff at all, and that meant those products weren't really testable. We could do stuff with the UI, but we couldn't ever we couldn't get to back-end APIs, or we didn't have access to them. It was stupid decisions behind those. But these things, they can be the hardest to solve, because if you're building a new product right from the beginning, you can put these principles in place, make sure you've got an accessible API, all that kind of stuff. If you're going onto an old product, or like a legacy product that was designed without these things in mind, then this is probably the hardest problem to solve. But it is an argument you can definitely make to your stakeholders, because you kind of fall into a vicious circle if you don't solve these things. So you know, your product manager might make the argument that, you know, oh, well, it'd be great to have, you know, a really, really great API in the back of the product, but it's going to take too long. We need all these new features. But it's a vicious cycle. If you don't put that effort in, your product isn't testable, so your development is going to be slower and less reliable. So it is actually, it's worth doing these. It's worth having these, I don't want to use the term arguments, it's worth having these debates with your stakeholders to try and get the time in to make your products testable so you can actually work with them. So those are the kind of two general testing rules. Then these are probably the more interesting ones now of the actual rules around UI testing. And the main focus of these is to try and keep UI actions to a minimum because it's added complexity. And what I said earlier about how, you know, a human can perceive everything around a system while they're working on it, WebDriver doesn't. So WebDriver sees elements. It doesn't see progress. You know, if it clicks a button, it's done. It doesn't pay or even know how to pay attention to what that kind of effect is unless we explicitly tell it things. But what this means is that the more UI steps you have in a test, each step is conditional on the last one. And you can check, so say you're clicking a button, then another icon appears, you can check for that, but what about that random pop-up that's appeared in the bottom corner? You know, we're working on very, very complex systems with very unexpected conditions. Every time you have a UI step, it's conditional on the last one, so the more than you string together, you know, it might be something weird happens in the first step, fourth step gets thrown off, it becomes less and less reliable. So what we want to be doing is having as few UI steps as possible, and that means really, really focusing on the actual scope of our tests. So that means, for the first rule, don't do any setup. Do not use the UI to set up conditions for your tests. The example we're going to go through in a minute, you'll see what I mean by this. But what you want to do is you want the system to be creating the conditions for testing for you. And similarly, no teardown. You don't want to be deleting your test data through the UI afterwards. You want the system to clean up after itself. So you can do this with, you know, triggering webhooks in your system, API posts, writing database entries. It's much quicker and much more reliable to do these things through, as we saw in Eagle's talk earlier, it's much easier to do this stuff through APIs or databases than it is through the UI. It's much more reliable and it's reducing the number of purely UI steps that we have in our tests. And then the last one is don't assert on visual conditions. And again, the example we're going to go through in a minute will kind of ram this one home, but a UI can update, but the UI could be completely wrong. You know, we need to make sure we need to assert on the actions that our UI actions have triggered. Those effects in the system, we want to assert on those. So, yeah, there's three very, very simple rules. What do they look like in practice? Because once we apply these, we want to be at a point where our tests are much more reliable, because we're asking WebDriver to do a lot less, because we want just to perform UI actions and nothing else. It's going to be doing what it's designed to do, which is just UI actions, so it's going to be much, much more reliable. And hopefully, because we've made everything simpler around our product, around our tests, everyone else on the team can get involved with it. It's much simpler to do. So yeah, we're going to go through an example. Quick thing though, this is really, really high level. It's not going to be a live demo because that would be mad. Live demos never ever work. And you know, we've all seen automation in action. It's like the computer's clicking things in the browser. It was cool like 5 years ago to watch it when it was kind of a novelty, but we've all seen it, haven't we? We don't need to do that. Because what we're going to do, this is much more about the principles of how we take an old test and change it to something much more reliable. So we're going to go through this scenario, we're going to look at how it was originally tested, then try and apply all these rules to it, and then rework the test. But it's going to be wordy examples, there's not going to be any code, because everyone codes in different languages and all that kind of stuff. But it's about the principles, it's not about line-by-line code with this. So, the scenario, a bit of backstory. This is an actual test that when I came onto the team that I work on now, which is the Guardian's editorial tools team. So we create a content management system that all our journalists use to create and publish our content. And this test, it's a really, really simple, straightforward one. It's just content entered by users is saved. That was it, nice and simple. So it's kind of an integration test of the whole system put together. We have lots of unit tests in our system, then we have a few UI tests right at the end that are kind of the full thing strung together of like the most important things we can do in there. So this is one of those. But the original test, so all of these steps are done via the UI. So when I came to the team, it was a WebDriver test, everything was on the UI, didn't dig into the system at all. So steps of what it's going to do, I will come back to this, so don't worry, you don't have to remember all of them. I really should have done screenshots thinking about it. But what it does is it goes to the main dashboard page of our application. It clicks a create button, which gives you a drop down of all the different content types. So it clicks that it wants to create an article. Then it populates all of the mandatory fields that it needs to publish a piece of content. Then it waits for a visual indication that those things have saved, because it saves automatically as you enter in content. Then it navigates to our management tab, where it can then delete the piece of content. And this was really, really bad, this test. It was really, really unreliable. It was really, really flaky. And I would argue it didn't actually prove anything either, or it proved that the UI could update. That was about it. But let's take the idea of this from our principles. So firstly, the principles we had around UI tests. Well, don't do any setup in the UI. Those first 3 steps, those are all setup. That's getting you to the point where you can test your condition of entering content. Those need to go. We can't do those in the UI, it's too unreliable. Then similarly, the last 2 steps, that's tear down, that's clean up after the test. Let's get rid of those as well. And then the 2 steps in the middle, so populating all the mandatory fields and waiting for the visual indication of save, that's the actual test, that's the actual execution. But visual indication that it's saved, that's not enough. It's only proven that the UI can update. Then other things about this test, it took about 25 seconds to run for one test. And it had that about 75% accuracy thing that we were talking about, because it got all these conditional steps. So yeah, not a great test. But what about those general testing rules as well? Well, luckily the system was testable. We didn't actually need to do anything to change that. It was a quite recently built product. It got a really great API on the back end that we could access really, really easily. But in terms of keeping it simple and keeping everything in a way that everyone on the team could work with, it was terrible at that. So at The Guardian, most of our products are built in Scala, and we use JavaScript for our front ends. This test was written in Java, which, yeah, Scala, Java, there's some similarities, but for all intents and purposes, it was in a completely different language to what everybody else on the team worked with. It used TestNG for its assertions. TestNG is great, but everyone else for their unit tests used Scala tests. It's just another thing that's just slightly different, but all these things add up. And then in terms of its run, the environment it ran on, we ran on Source Labs. And you use Source Labs? Source Labs is really, really great. It's like a cloud-based cross-browser testing platform. The aim being, you can run your test on multiple browsers. We're only testing on one browser because it's an internal tool, and our enterprise team control what browser versions all our users run on. So we didn't need to test cross-browser. But what it meant, though, was that it was only the tester on the team that had a login for Source Labs. So no one else on the team could actually see the place where the tests were running. There's no visibility. It's not good enough. And then in terms of reporting, again, it reported way away from where everyone else on the team worked. So this would just dump a report on a build machine. So devs don't tend to go on a build machine. They get notifications when things work, when things don't. It was just more distance, all these little things adding up to make it harder for anyone else on the team to jump in on the test. So what did we do? What could we do better? Well, first off, the infrastructure. So we put the test into Scala. It meant I hadn't done much Scala before I went onto that team, but it was a good way for me to learn Scala, start learning Scala, and it meant that it was then in the context of the rest of the team. There wasn't that context shift if anyone wanted to have a look at a test. And also we started using Scala test. Made a lot of sense. Then we wanted to run it in the simplest way possible. So great as Source Labs was, it wasn't doing it for the team. We either needed to get everybody a login for it, but we weren't using Source Labs for what it was actually designed for. So we just sort of stopped doing that. And we found that Circle CI, which is what we use for our continuous integration server, that actually gives you, out of the box, you can run WebDriver tests on Chrome instance on their boxes. Perfect. You know, the rest of the team works in Circle all the time. This is exactly the right place to put it. And then on failure, rather than just dumping a build report on the build machine, we'd actually do a notification to Slack, because if your dev teams are anything like mine, everyone's in Slack all the time. It's where all our systems alert to. So it's putting it in the context where everyone else is working all the time. So that was great. We could tick off all of these things really quite quickly. A lot of them were actually making things simpler. You know, we didn't have to worry about piping all our code over to source labs or anything like that. We could just run it on our build machine. So that was the keeping it simple part solved. What about those UI testing rules? So, you know, no setup, no takedown, no assertions in the UI. Well, first off, so that scenario, it was to make sure when we create a piece of content, it's saved. Nice and simple. The scope is, you know, creating the piece of content. We're testing that we're testing that the user action achieves something. So we still want to be testing on the UI, but only testing on the UI. We don't want to do any of our setup there. So first thing, setup steps. They were out of scope. We don't want to be navigating around the UI to create a test. So we did just do a post to our API. If you've not really done that much of this before, this is where we can start making technical decisions with our developers. You know, there's a million HTTP libraries. What ones is everybody else in your team using? Which ones are they familiar with? Which ones do they favour? Ask them. Start using those. And then when we post to the API, in the HTTP response we get back, we get the ID of the piece of content that it's created. And from that we can deduce the URL. So then our first step with WebDriver is to say, you know, go to this URL, but it's not going to the front page of the application, it's going to the actual page where it can start creating a piece of content. So those three setup steps we had before, they're gone. It's just one step now, and it takes, you know, split second to run. It's really, really fast. Job done, setup, it's finished. So we can actually start testing. We can do the actual scope of the test, and this is where we want to do things on the UI, because we're checking that when a user does something, something happens. So we're going to driver.find element, you know, locate everything that we want to enter text into, enter the text. But then we're going to make an API call again to see if the saves happen, because we were just asserting on the UI before. That only tells us the UI is updating. It doesn't tell us that anything's saved. So our API returns JSON. Again, chat to the devs, see which JSON libraries they liked, how they like working with JSON, which is a good learning thing as well, because I've not done that in Scala before. So we make an HTTP call, get the JSON back from the API. Oh, cool, all the fields have updated. Brilliant, they've saved. And then, yeah, we could still check that UI indicator, because it kind of comes up with a tick at the top of the screen when everything's updated for the users. So we do want the users to know that their work has been saved, but it's not the only place that we've got to check that action. So we're checking the API and we're checking the UI. Job done, testing's finished. And then for teardown, so before we were going into like a management tab, finding a delete button and then clicking delete to clean up our test. Again, HTTP call to the API and say, delete that piece of content. It's clean. It's really, really good. So that's super, super simple. And the end result being that the only UI actions we're performing are the actual scope of the test. So this ends up being, considerably faster. This test ran in it used to run in 25 seconds, it now runs in 4. And that whole 75% accuracy thing, I've actually got this running on, we'll talk about my production testing thing in a little bit, but I've got this running on our production environment, and it's at about like a 99.95 accuracy or something like that. It's super, super reliable. And that's because, you know, we've got a really, really good test now. It's working better. We're not maxing out WebDriver. We're not making it do loads of things we don't need it to do. Our whole team can get involved with the test, quickly debug and all that kind of stuff, because it's completely in their context. And we're not testing exclusively in the UI, and this is where it gets into that thing where we're not just replacing an old manual test now. We're testing in the scope of an automated test, so, you know, rather than just asking it to be human. So if you think about it, you know, quite often when you see some automation running, WebDriver can do UI actions really, really fast, but it takes ages to spin up. So quite often it's not actually that much faster than a person doing it. Whereas this can, making an HTTP call and interrogating some JSON, it can check an API considerably quicker than you can by going to the URL and parsing the JSON and all that kind of stuff. So we're testing in the world of automation now, not just replacing manual testing. You can do this with pretty much any technologies. In fact, some stuff, if any of you use like Espresso on Android, which is a UI testing framework, that actually enforces some of these rules. You can only stay within one activity of the app, so it's really enforcing you to not do any setup or tear down with your tests. And one thing about this was possible to do because the application was testable. I think I was saying about being able to get to the APIs and all that kind of stuff. If you haven't got that, then you can't really do this. So you need to solve that problem first. Which, right on time, brings us pretty much to the end. But the talk's called Freeing Up Selenium. So what are we freeing it up to do? Well, we're freeing it up to be like the best it can be. We're not asking it to replace manual testing. We're asking it to do the kind of testing that it is designed for. And that means that it's going to do that kind of stuff much better than the things we're asking it to do. So we can get much more creative with how we're using this stuff, rather than just being regression tests that run every time we merge into master or something like that. We've made the test really, really accurate, so it becomes a really reliable foundation for stuff like continuous delivery. You're quite happy that if your test pass, it's fine to release. You can have click commit, 5 minutes later it's up running in production. And you tie your test into commits. So all our developers use pull requests a lot. So there's always code reviews. As soon as you create a new pull request, it triggers our UI tests, or all our tests in fact. And the tests are really, really reliable. So we don't have to just restrict them to running on test environments now. I used to only ever run automated tests on test environments because I was worried that I'd make a mess. Say you start creating some content and the test falls over for whatever reason, and you leave that piece of content there. You can't do that in production. But if you've got a really, really reliable test that cleans up after itself really, really reliably, you can do that. So a system I built recently using WebDriver was we constantly have on our production servers now, we're always running a test. We have a few tests that loop, but they run once a minute, 24 hours a day. And before, I'd have been really, really worried that we'd have ended up with all this kind of like really messy content all over our servers. It doesn't happen now that we've got really, really reliable tests. And when they do fail, we then just have a job to clean them up. But they run at like 99.95% accuracy, so we can do that. And then we kind of come back to this thing of WebDriver. It recreates UI actions, it creates browser interactions. So we've even seen people kind of use it as like a tutorial help system, kind of guiding users through stuff by triggering from their mainline code, triggering web interactions. So it's not just for testing. Anywhere where we need a browser interaction, we can use WebDriver for that. So yeah, kind of the sky's the limit for what we can do with that. So yeah, thank you very much. Hopefully that's been useful for people.